Thank you very much. Distinguished Vice President, Excellencies, distinguished representatives, delegates and observers. Trafficking in persons is a serious human rights violation. Risks of trafficking, as we know, increase in situations of conflict, displacement, gender inequality, discrimination and poverty. Globally today, more than 117 million people are forcibly displaced. And as we meet today, more than 35,000 people have been killed in Gaza. It is estimated that as many as 15,000 children have been killed, with thousands more separated from their families or missing. With other special procedures mandate holders, we have called and call again for a permanent ceasefire, compliance with the International Court of Justice order for provisional measures, humanitarian access and unconditional release of hostages. I urge all Member States to work towards a just and lasting peace. My report that I present to you today addresses the issue of trafficking in persons, mixed migration and protection at sea. And despite the often contested nature of jurisdiction and the increasing criminalisation of migration, the normative framework of international law sets out a comprehensive range of obligations for all maritime actors, including states and non-state actors and international and regional entities. As this report highlights, the human rights of victims of trafficking and persons at risk of trafficking continue to exist at sea. The obligations to prevent trafficking in persons and to identify, assist without discrimination to continue to apply at sea and on disembarkation. The failure to fulfill those obligations increases risks of trafficking in persons and other serious violations of international law. In the Global Compact for Safe, Orderly and Regular Migration, states committed to international cooperation to save lives and prevent migrant deaths and injuries through individual or joint search and rescue operations, assuming collective responsibility to preserve the lives of all migrants in accordance with international law. In the Progress Declaration on the Global Compact, the states expressed deep concern that thousands of migrants continue to die or go missing each year along perilous routes on land and at sea. Many of those who die or go missing may be victims of trafficking, including child victims. And despite that reaffirmation of collective responsibility, according to the data collected by the Missing Migrants Project of the International Organization for Migration, at least 8,500 persons died on migration routes worldwide in 2023, making it the deadliest year on record. Slightly more than half of the deaths were as a result of drowning. I also highlight the multi-stakeholder pledge on developing comprehensive responses to the protection challenges faced by refugees and migrants moving by sea, presented at the Global Forum in 2023, which aims at encouraging states and other stakeholders to ensure the protection of asylum seekers, refugees, stateless persons and migrants moving by sea, in particular in the context of mixed movements. I urge states to join this pledge and to implement fully the commitments made. I highlight also the pledge on trafficking in persons presented at the Global Refugee Forum and encourage states to join this pledge, to commit to its implementation and to continued support. The often politicised and punitive responses to migration at sea, including restrictions on safe, regular migration, restricted access to asylum, pushbacks risking refoulement, arrest and detention on disembarkation and criminalisation of human rights defenders engaged in search and rescue operations, force people to take more dangerous, risky journeys. As such, these punitive responses increase the risks of trafficking in persons. Effective measures to prevent trafficking in persons must include the expansion of safe, regular opportunities for migration, pathways to international protection, including effective access to asylum, rights-based family reunification and resettlement. Excellencies, distinguished participants, for victims of trafficking at sea, first and foremost, the right to life must be ensured as a fundamental and non-derogable human right. States have an obligation to ensure that maritime actors can fulfil their duties towards persons in distress at sea. It is essential, therefore, that maritime actors are fully supported in meeting their search and rescue obligations. These obligations must be implemented without discrimination or regard to the status of the person being rescued, and as such equally apply to victims of trafficking and persons at risk of trafficking. Victims of trafficking at sea may also be victims of enforced disappearances, and as such, the obligations arising for states and all maritime actors in the context of enforced disappearances must be ensured. I highlight the recently adopted African Guiding Principles on the Human Rights of All Migrants, Refugees and Asylum Seekers, which provide that states shall establish or reinforce mechanisms to search for migrants who've gone missing or disappeared within their territory and on the high seas, and urge states to recognise that this includes victims of trafficking and persons at risk of trafficking. I highlight also the commitment made by states engaged in the Bali process, including to victim-centred and protection-sensitive strategies and to further capacity building of the relevant agencies in search and rescue operations. The obligations to identify victims of trafficking are positive obligations not dependent on self-identification and must take account of the trauma endured by victims, ensuring gender equality, best interest and rights of all children and non-discrimination. Disembarkation to a place of safety requires ensuring that all necessary measures to prevent trafficking in persons and to ensure effective protection are carried out. These include the positive obligations to identify, assist and protect without discrimination. Too often we see that weak identification and referral processes at sea and on disembarkation lead to failures of protection. Victims of trafficking face restricted access to essential services, both in the place in which they are identified and in their place of origin for reasons of cost, language barriers, limited services, lack of gender and trauma-informed practices, and failures of first responders to conduct appropriate risk assessments and referrals. Excellencies, distinguished participants, victims of trafficking have a special status in international law and rights to specialised assistance, including medical and psychosocial assistance, reproductive and sexual health services, safe accommodation and legal assistance. Trafficking victims must be provided immediately with unconditional assistance by trained and qualified personnel. For victims of trafficking with disabilities, the limited accessibility of information, assistance and protection services and access to justice leads to further failures of identification and gaps in protection at sea and on disembarkation. A focus only on physical or visible disabilities in screening or referral processes contributes to weak identification and protection gaps. It is essential that measures taken to ensure protection of the rights of victims of trafficking on disembarkation should include pathways to residence and stay, including pathways to long-term residence and citizenship. Asylum-seeking migrant and refugee children, particularly those who are unaccompanied and separated from their families and caregivers, are at high risk of trafficking at sea and on disembarkation. However, they are frequently hosted in unsafe accommodation centres, hotels or temporary lodgings, without guardians or protective environments. Child victims of trafficking are also at risk of detention on disembarkation in violation of the rights of the child and contrary to the principle of non-punishment. I am concerned at increasing restrictions on access to asylum in many regions. States must guarantee access to asylum procedures for those intercepted or rescued at sea. Designation of a place of safety requires ensuring effective access to asylum and protection against refoulement. States must ensure effective implementation of the obligation of non-refoulement and prohibition of collective expulsions, recognising the obligation to ensure individualised assessments of risk and protection needs of all victims of trafficking. It is essential to strengthen the capacity of all maritime and law enforcement actors to combat technology-facilitated trafficking at sea, including effective prevention and accountability measures. We must also ensure provision of sufficient financial and other resources for host communities, local authorities and ports, and coastal areas where disembarkations take place, to ensure protection of the rights of victims of trafficking and adequate resourcing of child protection services. In situations in which a state provides material support or assistance to another state to carry out search and rescue, there is an obligation to take all reasonable measures to ensure that the state performing the operations complies with the prohibitions of refoulement and collective expulsions. I highlight also that partnership with civil society is essential to combating trafficking in persons, and I am seriously concerned at the criminalisation of human rights defenders assisting migrants and refugees in distress at sea. To conclude, I call on all states to strengthen action to prevention trafficking in persons by expanding access to safe, regular migration pathways and strengthen refugee protection, including access to asylum, so as to reduce the risks arising from dangerous journeys by sea. Let me now turn to my report on my country visit to Colombia. First, I would like to commend the Government of Colombia for their excellent support and well-organised engagement with my mandate in advance of the visit, during and after the country visit. On my visit, I observed the continuing impact of conflict and the incidence of conflict-related trafficking, particularly affecting Indigenous and Afro-Colombian and rural communities, as well as the recruitment and use of children, child and forced marriage. This remains a serious concern, as does the continuing prevalence of conflict-related sexual violence, including trafficking for purposes of sexual exploitation and sexual slavery. I very much welcome the differentiated approach in national policies in combating trafficking in persons, under which the significance of gender, diverse gender identities, disability status, and race and ethnicity are recognised. This response recognises that stereotypes and systemic discrimination against women and girls and persistent racial discrimination affecting Afro-Colombian and Indigenous communities contributes to a normalisation of trafficking in persons. During the country visit, I visited border areas and observed people moving north through the Darien Gap daily, many of whom are at serious risk of trafficking for purposes of sexual exploitation and exploitation in criminal activities. Unaccompanied and separated children are particularly at risk. Further action is needed to strengthen the presence of civilian actors in border areas with international support and to ensure assistance and protection to prevent trafficking and protect victims. I urge the authorities to allocate sufficient resources to implement legislation, action plans and policy measures, particularly in rural areas, in conflict-affected areas and in border areas. I commend the measures taken to provide temporary protection status to Venezuelan refugees and urge the government to continue to ensure protection, particularly women and children who may be at risk of trafficking. I welcome the commitment to strengthening the rights of domestic workers and regulating labour conditions in sectors at risk, such as in mining. And I commend the progress made in the pioneering work of the transitional justice process. I call on all states to support the resolution presented for consideration at this Human Rights Council session on enhancement of technical cooperation and capacity building in the field of human rights in Colombia, to implement the recommendations of the Commission for the Clarification of Truth, Coexistence and Non-Repetition. This is particularly important to strengthen the gender dimensions of the peace agreement. Finally, I commend the commitment to achieving total peace, which is essential to combating trafficking in persons, and call for continued international support for the peace process. Excellencies, distinguished representatives, let me now turn to my report on my country visit to Central African Republic. I am grateful to the Government of Central African Republic for its willingness to facilitate my visit and for the constructive dialogue and engagement on human rights and trafficking in persons. I welcome the political will expressed of the President and Government to combat trafficking in persons. I commend the progress made in developing legislative and policy frameworks for the protection of human rights, including the adoption of the National Policy on Human Rights and specifically the 2022 Law on Human Trafficking. I particularly welcome legislative and policy measures to strengthen child protection and prevent trafficking of children, and I welcome the government's stated commitment to ending child and forced marriage and associated risks of trafficking, including for sexual exploitation and domestic servitude. However, despite progress in legislation and policy, implementation remains a challenge, particularly in rural areas, in situations of displacement, and against a background of continuing conflict and violence. Limited resources, closure of schools, internal displacement, including climate-related displacement and extreme poverty, hinder the effectiveness of prevention of trafficking and protection measures, particularly for children. I call on all parties to the conflict in Central African Republic to end all forms of conflict-related trafficking in persons and to end and prevent all 6 grave violations against children. I urge the authorities to take urgent action to facilitate access to justice in all parts of the country and I call for strengthened international support and financing for accountability and justice sector reforms, including to the Joint Rapid Response Unit on Sexual Violence Against Women and Children, to enable its effective functioning throughout the country and to ensure access to justice for victims and survivors. Prevention of trafficking, particularly of children, requires achievement of a just and lasting peace, disarmament and demobilization, and access to education, employment and livelihoods for the people of Central African Republic. Attention must also be paid to risks of trafficking for purposes of forced labour in at-risk sectors such as mining and domestic work. More effective oversight, prevention and protection mechanisms are required with continued support of the international community. Thank you, and I remain available for continued cooperation. Thank you.